Hi there, it's Erin from the Impatient Gardener, and today I want to talk to you about plants that are just a little bit different from the everyday plants that we commonly see in gardens. So behind me is my limelight hydrangea, and it is in its full glory right now. This is really when it's just going crazy, and one of the great things about limelight hydrangea is that it is just a stalwart in the garden. And that's why if you go on social media or you drive around, you will see limelight hydrangeas everywhere looking great. It's just a great plant. So I would never be without this plant in my garden, and a lot of people wouldn't be either, but this is nothing different. A lot of people have limelights, and I like this plant, but I also like to mix in plants that are slightly out of the ordinary, just because I think it gives the garden a little bit of personality. And I think some of these plants just suffer from no marketing being behind them. They're great plants, they just have, people just don't know about them because they aren't as widely known as things like this limelight behind me. So I thought today I would show you 5 plants with maybe a bonus. 5 plants that are a little bit more unusual, that you might have to look a little harder to go find, but that I think are really worthwhile candidates for being included in your garden. So the first plant I want to talk about is actually a grass. Down here you can see Cecilia automalis. This is common name is moorgrass, and this is a great little grass. These plants are this is only the second year in the ground for these years. It's a clump growing grass. So it's not a grass that's gonna run all over your yard, and I've been there and done that. I don't care to do that again. And as you can see, it's just starting to flower right now. So these are the flowers on it. It gets these they're a little scruffy looking, kind of scruffy looking long white flowers at the ends that stands to, you know, about 18 inches tall or so. But what I really like about this grass is that it has a really nice form. It's relatively short. This is as tall as it gets, obviously, with the flowers. It's relatively short, so you can work it in easily into the front part of a garden. But also it has a nice form that's like mostly upright, but just soft, so slightly weeping, so it's not going to drape all over other plants. It's never going to fall over in a big wind, and it just looks really great here. I couldn't be happier with how this plant is looking in my garden. Now, I will put all the stats up on the screen for you about this, but you know, one thing that I have read about this plant is that it doesn't really love super hot, humid areas. So if you're in a place that gets very hot, humid summers, it might not be the best choice for you. Obviously, like a lot of grasses, it likes sun. So it's in a full sun spot right here. It clearly is happy with that. I'm sure you could push that to a part sun situation. But I just love how it gives a little bit airier texture to a garden that really needs a little bit of movement to it, and grasses are so good for adding movement to the garden. So while you might have grasses in your garden, and I encourage you to look into them if you don't, because they really are lovely texture in the garden, this is one that you don't hear talked about very often, so I would say look out for Cecilia. So to tell you about the next plant, I have to get sort of up close and personal with all the bees and the wasps and all the other pollinators that are just going nuts for it, which is certainly one of the best attributes of this plant. So this is Angelica gigas, and this is a biennial, but right now it's in full bloom, and it gets these, well, starting to get in full bloom. There's lots more to come. It gets these great purple flowers. There are other Angelicas that get green flowers. This one is purple, quite like that. So this is a biennial. I bought a couple of plants one year at a plant sale, and everything else you see here has bloomed from those. It's there's a lot of activity over here. So they seed readily. So I pulled up a whole bunch of seeds and moved them to the new seedlings and moved them to the new garden. The good news is that they're very easy to identify when they're small plants. So if they seed where you don't want them to, it's very, very easy to just pull them out. But I do like to leave a few in this garden because to me this is amazing structure. It has that sort of prehistoric look, which I think looks great in gardens, and I think always adds interest. It's got a good amount of height, which I think we all need more in our gardens probably. It obviously is oh my gosh, they're just everywhere. It's obviously very attractive to pollinators, and it's beautiful in your garden. And certainly this is a different plant. Most people look at this and have no idea what this is. So this is one to look for, and the good news is that if you buy it once, you probably will have it forever. And what will happen is, you know, since it's a biennial, it will seed the next year. Those will become those will just be foliage one year, and then they'll flower the next year, and eventually you get yourself on a cycle where you have plants, flowers every year. Now, one of the things you might want to do is, the reason I bought plants 2 years in a row was that I'd always would have a set flowering. I have no idea what's what anymore. There always seems to be enough flowers here to keep me happy. So this next plant is probably one that you haven't heard of, because this is a relatively new plant to me. I recently discovered it. Actually, it was going through another garden, which is how I find so many other plants. I was in the Lurie Garden in Chicago a couple of years ago, and I started looking through the Lurie Garden's website to help me identify some of the plants there, and that's a fabulous resource. And I came across this, and this is Pycnanthema muticum. It's the blunt mountain mint. And right now it's flowering. These are actually, I believe, like calyxes on top here that you're seeing, which is sort of the gray thing, but there are tiny white flowers in here. And these are just in their second year. I had to look far and wide to find these plants. I actually planted several of them in the new garden because I found them, a better source for them, so I could plant more. So I think this plant is becoming a little easier to find because it is becoming more popular as people switch more towards natural gardens and native gardens, and are more interested in providing for pollinators. So there are no pollinators on this right now. This is only the second year I've had this plant. I think there's maybe 3 planted here. And I've seen photos of this, and almost everyone you talk to says it is the single best pollinator plant in their garden. So I'm looking forward to seeing this spread out and thrive. But it's quite a beautiful plant. Now, this is also great in floral arrangements. So if you're into that kind of thing, think about that. It has legs, you know, it's gonna move around a little bit. You wanna give it some space, and that's in its nature to do that. So just allow it that space to move around, and know that it is, once it gets happy, it is gonna start moving. Now, this is really an interesting spot for it. This spot gets a lot of midday sun, but early in the morning and by mid-afternoon on, it's almost like total shade over here. So I suspect this is growing in a little bit more shade than it might have preferred, but I think it's doing great. It's blooming well, it's looking great, and it's absolutely a plant that I wish more people knew about because I just think it's so cool looking. The next plant I want to show you is Epimedium, and I've got them all over the garden, but here's one of them that's actually looking pretty good right now. And I know you're going to look at this and say, this doesn't look like much right now, it just looks like some leaves. Well, let me start with all the benefits of Epimediums. First of all, they will do well in dry shade. You do have to get them established. So you can't just plant them, water them once and walk away. They do need to get established. But once you get them established, they can be just fine in dry shade. There are about 1 million of them, and they come with the coolest leaves in different colors, and heart-shaped leaves and long leaves. And there are so many of them out there. And if you get them in a happy spot, they will sort of happily fill in and spread around. Now, they do get a flower that's in pretty early spring, and flower colors are typically, there's a lot of yellows, there's some pinks, there's a few whites. There's, of course, other ones, because like I said, these are constantly, there's just a ton of them out there. But I think this is a plant that looks good. There's not a lot of plants that can bloom in early spring and then still have good looking foliage all year long. And that's what this is. It's got these really wiry stems, and it's just sort of delicate and fills in nicely. It's never aggressive. It just is sort of a nice little plant in the border. So another great one for shade. I mean, I think that shade plants, we often think hostas and ferns. And I have a garden full of hostas and ferns. I wouldn't want to be without them. But you can't just have hostas and ferns. You need some other texture in there, and frankly, it's more interesting. I mean, just as a gardener, it's more interesting to have some other plants to look at and explore and get to know. And so Epimedium is one that I think is underused, and they're not hard to find. Some varieties are difficult to find, but generally speaking, Epimediums are not difficult to find. You should be able to find them at most garden centers. I just think they get overlooked because they don't look like a lot in the beginning. So think of epimediums if you've got a shady spot, especially a drier shady spot. Consider an epimedium for that location because they just offer a lot in the garden, and again, a really nice, easy care plant. So I've actually already talked about this plant just a little bit in the patio tour video that we did not too long ago. But this is Thalictrum, and this specific one is black stockings. And Thalictrum, which is a common name is meadow rue, comes in all kinds of forms. There are tiny little ones that are great for rock gardens, and there's huge tall ones. In fact, I've got two of the tallest, which is Ellen, planted in the new garden, and so I hope they get super tall. This one is, now I've cut it back, I've cut the flowers back, but the flower stalks were, you know, I would say 5 feet, I'm 5'2", and they were probably, you know, at the top of my head, so about 5 feet tall probably. And it's called black stockings because it has very dark stems, not quite black. And then it gets these sort of airy, light lavender flowers. And that lavender color is pretty common in some of the Thalictrums. So I'm just really discovering the whole world of Thalictrums. I've grown this one for a long time. Once again, I went on a garden tour, I saw this plant, I had to have it, I researched it, and I put it in my garden, and it has done well. Thalictrums are so agreeable. They can put up with really full sun to part shade. Sometimes, depending on the variety, there's a little bit more specific requirements for them, but mostly they're pretty agreeable, easy care plants. Now, in the past, I've cut this down farther and it just has created a nice little mound of foliage. This year, I only cut it back basically to the height of the bottom of most of the flower stems. There's one leftover spent flower stem here just to clean it up a little bit, but it doesn't tip over. I have one variety, another variety that does tend to lean a little bit, and I have heard from some people who said that they do have a problem with theirs starting to lean. I think a little, they never completely flop over, so I think just the smallest amount of support would probably help them stay more upright. But I think the beautiful thing about this plant is it has such interesting foliage. It varies a little bit for, depending on the variety, but it looks a lot like columbine foliage, so a lot of people actually think it's like a giant columbine. It's not, but it's just nice, green, pretty foliage. And this is foliage that I think looks great in the garden all year long, even long after those flowers are gone. I would say the flowers last for, if I had to guess, I'd say maybe 3 weeks, which is probably typical perennial time for flowers to last. But it's a great plant to have in the garden, and I know I'm trying to add more to my garden and learn more about all the different varieties of Thalictrum. But black stockings is a popular one. It should be easier to find, and I think it's a really great one. It's performed well in my garden, but there is a whole world of them out there for you to discover, and I wish more people knew about them because I think it's a plant that deserves more attention than it's getting. So I told you guys there might be a little bonus, and this is the bonus plant. And I'm throwing this in at, first of all, how great is this looking with the light coming from the back right now? So pretty. This is, as you might have recognized, this is Irelia Sun King. And I'm putting this in as a bonus because I think a lot of people actually do know about this plant. It was the perennial plant of the year for 2020. So it's out there a lot more, but this is such a good plant. Now it looks like a shrub. But it's an herbaceous perennial, so this will die back to the ground and regrow every year. This is probably about average size for this. I have seen them much bigger than that. I think they want a little bit more water than they're getting in this specific situation right here, but as you can see, it's doing great. It does flower a little bit, small white flowers. They're inconspicuous, and it's not the reason you grow it at all. You grow it for this gorgeous foliage, which will range from a really bright chartreuse to more of a limey green to a grassy green even, depending on how much light it gets. But it's a shade lover. So that's the beauty of this. You get that bright pop in the shade, and it's got some size to it. Sometimes you can find some colorful things for shade, but a lot of times there's smaller plants. This has some size to it, and it really can make a statement, and especially can help break up, as in the case here, is what is essentially a sea of hostas and ferns. It offers such good texture, and just couldn't be simpler to grow. And it's deer resistant, no problems with deer on it at all, at least for me. So that's Irelia Sun King, and that's sort of a bonus one that I think you should consider. So I wanted to end right where we began, right here with this amazingly popular plant, which deserves all of the accolades that it has ever received. But I wanted to end here because this is a showy plant, and a lot of what I showed you is a little bit more subtle. They are great plants, and they make walking through a garden very interesting because they don't necessarily grab you if you're driving by at 50 miles an hour. But you wouldn't want a garden full of plants that just grab you. You need moments in the garden, and these small, interesting plants, or big, interesting plants, but different plants, add interest to a garden, and they make it a joy to work in and a joy to be in as well. So I hope you found some plants that are maybe you'd like to think about adding to your own garden, and do me a favor, leave a comment if you've got some other suggestions for great plants that you think are underused that people should really be using in their gardens more often, because I'm always looking for new plants, and I love to hear what you guys are growing that you wish the world would know about. Also, do me a favor and give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. I appreciate all of those likes and those subscribes. It means a lot. Thank you so much. We'll catch you soon in the next video.